The room held the scent of dust and unfulfilled promises, a stagnant air that clung to the heavy velvet curtains. I sat on the edge of our bed, the mattress a silent testament to a long-concluded armistice, its vast, cold space a territory we no longer contested. In my hands, I held an old photo album, its leather cover worn smooth by the ghosts of touches from a happier time. Each page was a shrine to the man I married, his laughter frozen in glossy squares, his vibrant eyes looking out from a past that felt like another person's life. That vibrant man was gone, replaced by the hollow silhouette slumped in the armchair by the window, a statue carved from apathy, outlined against the bruised purple of the city skyline at dusk. He was a constant, silent presence in our home, a living ghost whose quietude was louder and more painful than any argument could ever be. His condition had no name, no diagnosis that could be neatly filed away. The doctors had spoken in hushed, sympathetic tones, offering prescriptions that now sat untouched in the bathroom cabinet, their bright colors a mockery of our grayscale existence. It wasn't a failure of the body in a way they could measure, but a deeper, more profound extinguishing of a flame. He had lost his essence, that intangible core of masculinity that had once defined him, and its absence created a vacuum that pulled all the warmth and light from our lives. Our bed had become a desolate landscape, the sheets a cold barrier between two strangers who knew the intimate contours of each other's bodies but had forgotten the language of touch. The silence he cultivated was his fortress, and I was left outside its walls, shivering in a loneliness that was all the more acute for being shared. That evening, the oppressive quiet was shattered. His sister arrived like a whirlwind, blowing into the apartment on a gust of wind that carried the scent of rain and a sharp, expensive perfume that seemed to cut through the stale air. She was the antithesis of the stillness we inhabited, a vibrant comet of life, all kinetic energy, loud laughter, and eyes that danced with an untamable fire. She was a riot of color in her cashmere coat, a stark contrast to the muted tones of our living room. Her presence was an immediate and profound disruption, an electric current sent through a dead circuit, forcing the very atoms in the room to rearrange themselves around her. She paused in the doorway of the bedroom, her stiletto heels silent on the plush rug, her gaze sweeping across the scene with an unnerving acuity. Her eyes moved from the hunched figure of her brother, lost in the shadows, to me, perched on the edge of the bed with the artifacts of our dead past in my lap. I braced myself for the familiar look of pity, the soft, tilted head and sad smile I received from friends and family, but there was none. Instead, her look was sharp, intelligent, and deeply perceptive. It was a gaze of pure, unadulterated understanding that stripped away my defenses and saw right through to the raw, aching core of my solitude, making me feel completely and utterly exposed. A slow, hot flush of shame crept up my neck under the weight of her stare. It felt as if she could see the years of neglect I wore like a second skin. The subtle slouch in my shoulders from the burden of unwept tears. I instinctively snapped the photo album shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room, a reflexive gesture to hide the evidence of what we had lost. Her presence was a mirror, forcing me to confront the full extent of the decay, a truth I had become adept at blurring around the edges. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was seeing our situation not through the fog of my own resignation, but through her clear, unflinching eyes, and the reality of it was stark and horrifying. Without a word, she moved into the room with a fluid grace that was captivating. She walked past me to her brother's chair, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of familiar affection that he barely seemed to register, his posture remaining unchanged. Then she turned and began a slow tour of our apartment, her touch light as she trailed her fingers over the dusty surface of a bookshelf, a silent commentary on the state of our lives. She moved to the large window he always stared out of, and, with a decisive push, unlatched it, allowing the cool, damp night air to rush in. It was a simple act, but it felt monumental, a deliberate ventilation of the suffocating atmosphere we had been breathing for so long. The texture of the silence in the room began to change. It was no longer a hollow, empty void, but something charged, humming with the energy of her presence. The stale scent of forgotten things was now layered with the fresh smell of the city after a storm and the lingering notes of her perfume. I watched as my husband, who had remained motionless for hours, subtly shifted in his chair, a minute adjustment of his weight, but it was the first voluntary movement I had witnessed all evening. Her arrival was a stone cast into the still, murky waters of our existence, and the concentric ripples were already beginning to spread, distorting the familiar, miserable reflection on the surface. She left as suddenly as she had appeared, with a brief, enigmatic smile directed at me that offered nothing and promised everything. The front door clicked shut behind her, leaving behind only the ghost of her fragrance and a profound and unsettling sense of alteration. I remained on the edge of the bed, the cold air from the open window raising goosebumps on my arms. The suffocating stillness of the room had been broken, its spell lifted. I did not know what she had seen in her silent assessment, nor could I guess at her intentions, but the oppressive quiet that had been my constant companion for so long now felt different. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the charged, expectant quiet that comes just before the breaking of a storm. She began to visit more frequently, her arrivals becoming a welcome disruption to the monotonous rhythm of our days. She filled the silent apartment with a vitality it had long been missing, her energy a stark contrast to the heavy lethargy that had settled over my husband and, by extension, me. Her presence was never intrusive. Rather, it was as if she were methodically reclaiming the space from the grip of sorrow, one small, deliberate act at a time. The apartment, once a tomb of quiet resignation, slowly began to feel like a home again, infused with her vibrant spirit. With each visit, she brought offerings that reawakened my dormant senses. One day, it was the scent of fresh lilies, their perfume cutting through the dusty air. The next, it was the sharp, clean aroma of lemons from a pie she baked in our underused kitchen. She would put on quiet, instrumental music, its gentle melodies filling the spaces where conversations used to be, encouraging the shadows on the walls to dance. These were not grand gestures, but small, consistent injections of life that slowly began to chip away at the gray veneer that had coated my world. My husband accepted her ministrations with a detached, passive gratitude. He would accept the plate of food she prepared with a quiet nod, his eyes remaining fixed on the pages of his book or the shifting patterns of light on the far wall. He was an island in the middle of the current she created, acknowledging its existence but remaining untouched by its flow. He seemed content to observe this new life from a distance, and in his passivity, a space was created between the two of us, a space that she, perhaps unintentionally, began to occupy. One evening, after my husband had retreated to the bedroom earlier than usual with a mumbled excuse, the silence he left behind felt different. It was no longer the oppressive, empty quiet I had grown to dread. Instead, it was filled with the lingering echoes of her laughter and the faint floral notes of her perfume. The old, familiar ache of loneliness began to seep back in as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the sterile countertops. But it was tempered by a new, unidentifiable feeling of anticipation. She found me at the kitchen island, leaning against the cool granite as if it were the only thing holding me upright. She didn't speak, but moved behind me with a silent grace that was becoming familiar. Her hands came to rest on my shoulders, her touch gentle but firm, and I flinched, startled by the unexpected contact. My body was so unaccustomed to being touched with any kind of intention that the simple gesture felt seismic, a tremor in the foundations of my isolation. Instead of pulling away, she held her ground, her fingers beginning to work into the tight, unforgiving knots of muscle at the base of my neck. Her thumbs pressed into the rigid cords of my shoulders, a deep, knowing pressure that sought out the precise epicenters of my stress. A warmth spread downwards from her touch, a slow, melting sensation that I had not felt in years. It was a purely therapeutic gesture, yet it felt profoundly intimate, a direct communication that bypassed the need for clumsy, inadequate words. A long-held breath escaped my lips in a sigh that was almost a sob, the sound swallowed by the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My body, which had been a fortress of tension for years, began to surrender under the skill of her hands. I allowed my head to fall forward, giving her better access, a silent capitulation. With each circular motion of her thumbs, I felt a layer of armor I hadn't even known I was wearing begin to dissolve, leaving me feeling vulnerable and strangely weightless. Her movements became less about releasing tension and more about exploration. Her fingers traced the line of my spine through the thin cotton of my dress, each vertebra a small discovery. The touch with featherlight now, no longer a massage, but a caress, a delicate mapping of my form. A shiver traced the path her fingers had drawn, a purely physical reaction that sent a jolt of electricity through my system, waking nerves that had long been asleep. Every instinct screamed at me to pull away, to reestablish the boundaries that were now irrevocably blurred. To do so would have been the sensible, correct thing to do. Yet I remained still, rooted to the spot, held captive by a feeling I could not name. Instead of stepping forward, I found myself tilting my head to the side, a silent, subconscious invitation to continue, an act of surrender that was also an act of profound desire. I felt her breath on my skin, a warm, moist whisper against the sensitive curve where my neck met my shoulder. She paused for a single, heartbeat-long moment, a silent question hanging in the air between us. Then I felt the barely there pressure of her lips against my skin. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery, a soft, tentative touch that was over almost as soon as it began, yet it branded me with its heat. She did not move away immediately. Her hands remained on my shoulders, and the warmth of her mouth lingered on my neck. The air in the kitchen grew thick, charged with the unspoken reality of what had just passed between us. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder, amplifying a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of that single, illicit touch. A small, treacherous part of my mind registered that this was wrong, a betrayal on a fundamental level, but it was drowned out by another, much louder truth. For the first time in years, I felt something other than invisible. I felt seen. I felt desired. I felt alive. And in that moment, in the sterile quiet of my kitchen, that feeling was more important than anything else in the world. My husband's departure for a few days left a vacuum in the apartment, a silence so profound it seemed to have its own physical weight. This was a different kind of quiet from the one I had grown accustomed to. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of his presence, but a hollow, echoing emptiness that amplified my own solitude. For the first day, I moved through the rooms like a ghost in my own life, the absence of his silent judgment doing little to alleviate the profound loneliness that had become my constant companion. The apartment felt like a ship adrift, its anchor pulled, and I was its only passenger, with no destination in sight. She arrived on the second evening, not with a formal knock, but with the familiar sound of her key in the lock, a casual intimacy that had become routine. In her hand, she held a bottle of deep red wine, its label elegant and promising. We didn't bother with the dining table, instead settling on the plush rug in the living room, a space that felt less formal, less haunted by the ghosts of silent dinners. She lit a few candles, their soft, flickering light immediately transforming the room into a warm, intimate sanctuary, a world away from the cold, indifferent city outside. We talked for hours, the wine loosening my tongue and dissolving the inhibitions I had carefully constructed over the years. I heard myself speaking of things I hadn't given voice to in ages, old dreams, forgotten hobbies, the person I used to be before my life shrank to the dimensions of this apartment. She listened with an intensity that made me feel as though my words were the most important thing in the world, her gaze never wavering, her occasional questions sharp and insightful. For the first time, I felt a genuine connection, a shared understanding that went deeper than the polite sympathies of friends. Later, as a slow, languid song began to play from the stereo she had turned on, she stood up in one fluid motion, her silhouette outlined against the fire she had built in the hearth. She extended a hand to me, an unspoken invitation. A wave of hesitation washed over me, a feeling of awkwardness at the prospect of such a simple, joyful act. But her smile was gentle, encouraging, and I found myself placing my hand in hers, allowing her to pull me to my feet. Our initial movements were clumsy, a hesitant shuffling on the rug as we found our rhythm. I was stiff, my body unaccustomed to being held, to moving in sync with another. But she was a patient and graceful leader, guiding me with a subtle pressure at the small of my back until our steps fell into place. I let my head rest against her shoulder, the scent of her hair, something clean and floral, filling my senses. And for the first time in an eternity, I simply allowed myself to be held. When the song ended, the final note hanging in the air like a held breath, we did not move apart. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now, charged with a new and potent energy. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her dark eyes searching mine in the flickering candlelight. The space between us hummed with unspoken questions and undeniable answers. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in and pressed her lips to mine. The kiss was a revelation. It was not the clumsy, forgotten act I remembered, but something soft and questioning, a gentle exploration. There was the taste of wine and something else, something uniquely her, a flavor that was both sweet and intoxicating. A tremor went through me, a shockwave of feeling that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. A voice in my head screamed that this was a line that should never be crossed, but it was drowned out by the thunderous, desperate beating of my own heart. I answered the kiss, a silent surrender to a current far too strong to fight. My hands, which had been resting awkwardly on her arms, moved of their own accord, my fingers tangling in the soft silk of her hair. Her own hands slid from my back to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more demanding, and I met her passion with a desperate, hungry energy I didn't know I possessed. We sank to the floor without breaking contact, a slow, graceful collapse onto the soft rug before the fire. The world narrowed to this single point in time, to the warmth of the flames on one side of my body and the heat of hers on the other. The act of undressing was slow, reverent, a process of mutual discovery. Her fingers were deft and sure as they unfastened the buttons of my blouse, her gaze following the path of her hands as she revealed the pale skin beneath. The firelight cast dancing shadows across our bodies, painting us in hues of gold and amber. I explored the foreign, beautiful landscape of her form, the soft curve of her hip, the smooth expanse of her back, the delicate line of her collarbone. Every touch was an act of worship, every kiss a discovery. This was a language of the body I had never known, a dialogue of equals, of shared pleasure and mutual adoration. She brought my body back to life with a patience and skill that left me breathless. Her hands and her mouth were instruments of incredible pleasure, finding and awakening nerves that had lain dormant for years, coaxing responses from me that were raw, primal, and utterly involuntary. I was unmade and remade in her arms, my identity as a neglected wife dissolving in the heat of a passion so intense it felt like a purification by fire. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the rug, our bodies slick with sweat, our breathing slowly returning to normal. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the faint, distant sirens of the city. I felt her hand stroking my hair, a gesture of such simple, profound tenderness that it brought tears to my eyes. In the warm, glowing aftermath, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental within me had been irrevocably altered. The woman who had existed before that kiss was gone forever. The 2 days that followed were a pocket of time suspended outside of reality. The apartment, which had for so long been my prison, transformed into a sanctuary, our shared world. We did not leave. We unplugged the phones and ignored the insistent buzz of the intercom, creating a bubble in which the outside world ceased to exist. The oppressive silence of the preceding years was replaced by a tapestry of new sounds, the soft murmur of our conversations, the sizzle of garlic in a pan, the quiet melodies of music that played from dawn until long after dusk. We rediscovered the simple, profound intimacy of domesticity. We cooked together in the kitchen, a space I had come to associate with solitary, joyless routine. Now it was a place of laughter, of bumping hips and flour on our clothes. We ate not at the formal dining table, a monument to our marital distance, but cross-legged on the floor, sharing a single plate, our fingers occasionally brushing as we reached for a piece of bread. These were the small, mundane acts of a shared life, and yet for me, they were utterly revolutionary. Our conversations were endless, flowing with an ease I had never known. We spoke of everything and nothing, from the books we had loved as children to the secret, unspoken fears that haunted our adult lives. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a deep, empathetic listening that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was starved for. In her presence, I was not a wife, not a caretaker, not a woman defined by her husband's affliction. I was simply myself, a person worthy of attention and interest. We took a long bath one afternoon, filling the tub with steaming water and fragrant oils until the room was thick with a floral haze. The experience was one of pure, sensual indulgence, stripped of any performative expectation. I washed her hair, my fingers working the shampoo into a rich lather, marveling at the simple, tactile pleasure of the act. She, in turn, traced the lines of my shoulder blades with a soapy sponge, her touch gentle and reverent, as if she were learning the contours of a precious artifact. It was an act of profound care, a quiet ceremony of mutual adoration. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting stripes of light and shadow across the bed. I awoke to the sensation of her lips trailing a slow path from my shoulder to the hollow of my throat. It was a gentle, lazy awakening, a stark contrast to the jolting, anxious mornings I had grown used to. I lay on my back as she propped herself up on one elbow, her hair falling like a dark curtain around her face, her eyes holding mine with an expression of tender, focused desire that made my heart ache with its beauty. She took her time, her exploration of my body a slow, deliberate act of worship. Her lips and tongue were instruments of exquisite artistry, teasing and tasting, building a slow, simmering heat deep within me. She seemed to take as much pleasure from my reactions, the sharp intake of my breath, the involuntary arch of my back, as I did from her touch. In her gaze, I was not flawed or aging. I was beautiful, a source of pleasure, an object of devotion. This feeling was so powerful, so new, it was almost painful. Her fingers found me with an unerring confidence, a knowledge of my body that felt both innate and exquisitely learned. She moved with a skill and patience that drove me to the edge of reason, holding me there, suspended in a state of pure sensation, until I was begging without words. The release, when it came, was not a quiet surrender, but a shattering, a tidal wave of pleasure that washed away years of loneliness and neglect, leaving me trembling and utterly undone in its wake. It was a reclaiming of a part of myself I thought had been lost forever. Later, while she slept, the morning sun warming her bare shoulder, I slipped out of bed and went into the bathroom. I stood before the large vanity mirror, my body still humming with the aftershocks of her touch, and for a long moment I simply stared. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. The familiar, tired lines of anxiety around my eyes seemed to have softened, and the perpetual downturn of my mouth was gone, replaced by a faint, relaxed curve. There was a flush to my skin, a brightness in my eyes I hadn't seen since my wedding photos. It was more than just the afterglow of pleasure. A fundamental shift had occurred. The reflection showed not just a woman who had been made love to, but a woman who had come back to life. The heavy cloak of invisibility I had worn for so long had been cast off, and in its place was a visible, tangible radiance. A single clear thought rose in my mind. This is who I am. It was a rediscovery so profound that it brought a lump to my throat. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock was a gunshot in our peaceful world. The noise was violent, intrusive, shattering the sanctity of our bubble in an instant. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, panicked bird. We both froze, her eyes flying open to meet mine across the room, a silent, shared understanding passing between us. The magic was over. The real world, in all its cold, hard reality, was flooding back in. He entered the apartment, dropping his overnight bag by the door with a dull thud. He wore the same weary, detached expression, his shoulders slumped with a familiar resignation. He moved through the living room, his gaze distant, seeming to look right through the lingering evidence of our idyll, the wine glasses on the floor, the rumpled throw blanket before the cold hearth, without registering any of it. He was a ghost returning to his haunting grounds, oblivious to the vibrant life that had taken root in his absence. He stopped in the doorway of the bedroom, his gaze finally falling on me as I stood frozen by the bathroom mirror. For a fraction of a second, his vacant expression wavered. A flicker of something, confusion, surprise, perhaps even recognition, crossed his features. He saw it. He saw the change in me, the alien glow of happiness that I had not yet had time to conceal. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken words, before he simply gave a slow, tired nod, turned and walked into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. The silence he left in his wake was heavier than ever before. Our life settled into a new, precarious rhythm, a complex choreography performed on the knife edge of discovery. Her visits became a fixture of our weekly routine, no longer a surprise, but an integrated part of our strange, altered existence. She would arrive under the guise of helping with groceries or simply checking on her brother, and the apartment would transform from a mausoleum into a stage. My husband was the unwitting audience, or perhaps the ghost in the theater, present in his armchair, but seemingly oblivious to the vibrant, dangerous play unfolding around him. We developed a silent, secret language, a vocabulary of illicit touches and charged glances conducted in plain sight. It was a thrilling and terrifying game. Her fingers would linger on mine for a fraction of a second too long as she passed me a cup of tea, a jolt of electricity passing between us that was invisible to the room's third occupant. Under the dinner table, the side of her foot would press against mine, a sustained, secret pressure that sent a wave of heat through my entire body. These were tiny, fleeting moments, but they were the keystones of our hidden world, each one a shared secret that bound us closer together. My husband, in his self-imposed exile from the world of feeling, became a part of the landscape. He was the mountain in the distance, a fixed point against which we measured our movements, but he was not an active participant in our weather. His presence, once a source of constant, aching pain, was now a necessary prop for our deception. He would read his books, his face impassive, as we exchanged a look across the room so filled with longing and shared memory that it felt like a physical shout. I began to wonder if his ignorance was a choice, a willful blindness that was its own form of surrender. The guilt I had anticipated, the shame I felt I should be drowning in, was a strangely muted presence. It was overshadowed by the sheer, exhilarating force of being truly alive again. My body, which had felt like a stranger's for so long, was now my own, humming with a constant, low-level thrum of pleasure and anticipation. This secret happiness became a fierce, protective instinct within me. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances, a woman slowly fading into the wallpaper of her own life. I was an active, willing participant in a dangerous game, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was willing to risk everything to keep playing. Paradoxically, the atmosphere in the apartment became lighter, less fraught with tension. My own transformation had a ripple effect. I was no longer a walking embodiment of sorrow and reproach, my silent misery a constant unspoken accusation against my husband. Freed from the burden of my unhappiness, he seemed to relax in my presence. A strange, twisted kind of peace settled over our home. He was no longer a disappointment to me, and I was no longer a problem for him to fail to solve. We had achieved a perverse form of equilibrium, built on a foundation of the most profound deceit imaginable. The duality of my existence was most acute at night. I would perform the familiar rituals of a wife, helping him with his medication, turning down the covers on his side of our cold, barren bed. I would lie beside him in the darkness, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing until I was sure he was deep in a medicated sleep. Then my true life would begin. I would slip out of the bed like a thief, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floors, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I made my way through the darkened apartment. The guest room, where she often stayed now, had become my sanctuary. Crossing its threshold was like stepping into another dimension, a world of warmth and whispered secrets. There, in the soft glow of a single lamp, we would shed the roles we played during the day. She was not his sister, and I was not his wife. We were simply two people connected by a fierce, unlikely passion, finding solace in the dark. Our nights were a slow, unhurried exploration, a communion that was as much about emotional intimacy as it was about physical pleasure. In her arms, I found not just passion, but a profound sense of peace. We would talk for hours in hushed tones, sharing secrets that we had never spoken aloud to another soul. Her bed was a haven, a place where I was not just desired, but understood. This new happiness was a fragile, beautiful thing, a rare orchid blooming in the toxic soil of our shared deception. I was fully aware that it was a happiness built on a lie, a precarious structure that could collapse at any moment. But in the quiet darkness of the night, holding her close, it felt like the only truth that mattered. One night, a gnawing thirst pulled me from a deep sleep. The space beside me in the bed was empty, a familiar hollow that no longer brought a pang of loneliness, merely a dull ache of habit. My husband was often a nocturnal wanderer, his silent perambulations through the darkened apartment a common occurrence. I slid out from under the covers, my movements practiced and silent, my bare feet making no sound on the floor as I made my way towards the kitchen for a glass of water, careful not to disturb the fragile peace of the house. As I approached the living room, I froze. A thin sliver of light escaped from beneath the door, a pale, golden line slicing through the oppressive darkness of the hallway. Muffled voices emanated from within, so low they were almost indistinguishable from the ambient hum of the city outside. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I crept forward, every nerve ending alive with a sudden, inexplicable dread, my hand hovering just inches from the cool wood of the door. I peered through the narrow gap between the door and its frame, my eye pressed so close I could feel the faint vibrations of their speech. The scene within was bathed in the soft, intimate glow of a single table lamp. They were sitting on the sofa, not side by side, but facing each other, their knees almost touching. It was her and it was him. But this was not the man I knew. This was not the vacant, hollowed-out shell who inhabited our days. The ghost was gone. The man on the sofa was alert, his posture engaged, his eyes clear and lucid. He was looking at his sister with an expression of such profound, unadulterated gratitude that it struck me with the force of a physical blow. There was no trace of the foggy detachment, the empty gaze that had been his constant shield. He was speaking in low, earnest tones, and she was listening intently, her head tilted in that familiar, perceptive way, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was a scene of startling intimacy, a secret, shared world I had never known existed. Then I saw him reach out. His hand, which had for so long been limp and lifeless at his side, moved with a clear and deliberate purpose. He covered her hand where it rested on her knee, his fingers enclosing hers in a gesture of deep, uncomplicated affection and alliance. It was a gesture of solidarity, of a shared understanding that ran deeper than any I could have imagined. And in that single, silent movement, the carefully constructed reality of my last few months shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The truth crashed down on me not like a wave, but like a building collapsing, the weight of it crushing the air from my lungs. This was not a random series of events. His withdrawal, his illness, her sudden, constant presence in our lives, her unerring instinct for the precise nature of my loneliness and desire. It was not a coincidence. It was a design, a meticulous, Machiavellian, and utterly monstrous plan. They had orchestrated the entire affair. He couldn't be the man I needed, the husband I craved. So, in an act of what could be seen as either the most selfless love or the most profound cruelty, he had found someone who could. He had not simply stepped aside, he had curated his replacement. He had chosen his own sister to fill the void he had created, to minister to the needs he could no longer meet. He hadn't been a passive, oblivious victim in this drama. He had been its silent, brilliant director, and I, its unwitting star. I backed away from the door, my movements numb and robotic, my mind a screaming vortex of shock and betrayal. I retreated to the bedroom, the sanctuary that was now a crime scene, and slid back into the cold, empty bed. I lay on my back, staring into the oppressive darkness, the ceiling seeming to spin above me. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a conspiracy of care, a perversion of love so complete and so twisted that I had no framework to understand it. They hadn't just saved me, they had entrapped me in a truth more bizarre and suffocating than the lie I had been living. I closed my eyes, a single hot tear finally escaping and tracing a cold path down my temple. But I no longer knew if I was weeping from grief or from a terrifying, dawning sense of gratitude.